My wife kissed me goodnight and left me alone, but a few minutes later, her aunt knocked on my door and whispered, "Can I come in?" It was a simple moment, one I'd lived through countless times before, yet somehow that night it felt heavier, sharper, almost unbearable in its quietness. My wife leaned over me, pressing her lips briefly against my forehead. The kiss was gentle, polite even, but it carried no warmth, no lingering tenderness. She smiled faintly, the kind of smile you offer when you're distracted, already half turned towards something else. And then she whispered goodnight and slipped out of the room. I lay there, staring up at the ceiling, listening as the sound of her footsteps faded down the hall. The echo of her slippers against the wooden floor seemed to stretch into silence far too quickly, leaving me alone with nothing but the hum of the air conditioner and the restless weight in my chest. The bed felt cooler than usual. I pulled the blanket higher, trying to capture some sense of comfort, but the fabric brushed against my skin like a reminder of emptiness rather than warmth. I inhaled, catching a faint trace of her perfume still lingering in the sheets, soft, floral, familiar. It should have been enough to soothe me, but instead it reminded me of how close she had been and how far away she truly was. It wasn't that I resented her. Not at all. She was kind, consistent, steady in her own way. But lately, our marriage had grown into something like a routine, a pattern followed with precision but without passion. She tucked me in, as if checking a task off a list, and then disappeared into her own world. I wondered, not for the first time, when the last time was that she had stayed beside me after saying goodnight. When had her touch stopped lingering? When had her gaze stopped searching mine with curiosity? I turned onto my side, the sheets rustling and the dim lights spilling through the curtains. The house was quiet, yet it wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was the kind that made every small sound feel exaggerated. The ticking of the clock on the nightstand felt louder than it should, each second stretching long, pulling me further into thoughts I wished I could escape. There was a dull ache in my chest, not anger, not even disappointment, but loneliness. The kind of loneliness that doesn't announce itself loudly, but creeps in gradually until it fills every corner of a room. It was strange, really. I was married, not living alone, yet the space between us felt wider than it ever had. I closed my eyes, trying to will myself into sleep, but the darkness only sharpened my awareness. My body longed for something simple, the warmth of an arm draped across me, the weight of another heartbeat against mine, the reassurance that someone was near. But instead I lay still, my hand resting against the cool pillow beside me, pretending not to notice how empty it was. And just as the heaviness of solitude threatened to settle fully into me, a sound stirred the air, a faint, hesitant knock at the door. The sound was so soft at first, I almost thought I had imagined it, a faint tapping that broke the stillness of the room. My eyes opened, adjusting to the dim light. For a moment, I lay completely still, the echo of that sound lingering in the quiet. Then it came again, gentle, deliberate, unmistakable. Someone was at my door. I sat up slowly, my heartbeat quickening with a mix of curiosity and unease. The knock wasn't urgent, not the sharp rapping of someone demanding attention. It was careful, almost hesitant, as if the person on the other side wasn't entirely sure they should be there. Pulling the blanket aside, I swung my legs over the edge of the bed. The floor was cool against my feet as I stood, each step toward the door sending a new rush of questions through my mind. Who could it be at this hour? My wife? No, she had gone to her own room earlier, and she rarely returned once she left. I reached for the handle, my fingers pausing there for a second. The silence pressed in again, and I almost convinced myself not to open it, to retreat back into the bed and let the night remain unbroken. But something in that knock, the softness of it, the quiet patience, pulled at me. When I finally opened the door, the hallway light spilled into the room, outlining the figure standing there. It wasn't my wife. It was her aunt. She looked to be in her early 40s, her robe drawn loosely around her frame. Her dark hair, usually pinned neatly during the day, now fell in soft waves around her face, catching the warm glow of the lamp behind her. There was no sign of boldness in her expression. Instead, she looked calm, almost fragile, her eyes searching mine with a mixture of question and reassurance. "Can I come in?" she asked softly. The words hung in the air between us, simple yet charged with something I couldn't quite name. Her voice was gentle, carrying none of the hesitation her presence suggested, as though she had already decided but still wanted permission. I swallowed, suddenly aware of the rapid beat of my own heart. The faint rustle of her robe as she shifted, the way her hand tightened slightly around the fabric near her collar, all told me this wasn't casual. It wasn't the kind of request made out of boredom or habit. She was standing there for a reason she hadn't spoken yet. "Of course," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. I stepped back, holding the door wider. She entered with a kind of graceful caution, her bare feet making almost no sound against the floor. As I closed the door softly behind her, I realized the room already felt different. Less empty. Less cold. And in that moment I knew the night was no longer about loneliness. Something had shifted. Something I didn't yet understand, but could feel deep in my chest. She walked toward the bed with a quiet steadiness, the fabric of her robe whispering against her legs as she moved. The small lamp on my nightstand cast a muted glow, barely enough to light the corners of the room, but just enough to catch the soft contours of her face. Her expression carried something I hadn't seen before, not just calmness, but a kind of unspoken need. She lowered herself onto the edge of the mattress. The bed dipped slightly under her weight, the shift sending a faint ripple through the sheets. I sat down beside her, keeping a respectful distance at first, though even from that space I could feel the warmth of her presence spreading toward me like the glow of a fire. "I couldn't sleep," she said after a moment, her voice almost a whisper. "The house felt too quiet." I nodded, not trusting myself to say much. Her words mirrored my own thoughts, though I hadn't admitted them out loud. It struck me how strange it was that in this house full of people, we could both feel so isolated. We began to talk, not about anything monumental, just fragments of life that somehow mattered more in the stillness of night. She mentioned a book she had been reading, the way it kept pulling her mind toward memories she thought she had forgotten. I spoke of my restless nights, of how the silence in my room sometimes pressed heavier than noise. Our conversation unfolded slowly, naturally, like two streams meeting at a bend. There was no rush, no pressure to fill every gap. The pauses between words felt as important as the words themselves, carrying weight and comfort. At one point, she shifted slightly closer. Her robe brushed softly against my leg, a fleeting contact that sent a current through me. I glanced at her, but she didn't seem startled by the nearness. Instead, her eyes were focused downward, thoughtful, as if she, too, was feeling something she hadn't expected. The room had changed. Where before it had felt like a hollow box, cold and unwelcoming, now it seemed alive. Her presence filled the space, the faint sound of her breathing, the subtle fragrance of her skin, the quiet steadiness of her voice. I found myself studying the details I had overlooked before, the way the soft light picked out a few silver strands in her hair, the curve of her hand resting against her lap, the gentle rise and fall of her shoulders when she exhaled. There was beauty in those small, unguarded details, beauty I hadn't expected to notice so vividly. As the minutes slipped by, I realized how easy it was to sit there with her. Easier than it had been with anyone in a long time. There was no performance, no expectation. Just two people sharing silence, words, and the comfort of proximity. And beneath it all, there was something else, an almost imperceptible current running between us. It wasn't spoken, and it wasn't acted upon. But I could feel it, alive and quiet, humming just beneath the surface of our conversation. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel alone. For a while, our words lingered in the safe territory of ordinary things, the weather, the way the days all seemed to blur together lately, even the small frustrations of daily routines. But little by little, the conversation slowed, leaving longer pauses, the kind that carried weight rather than emptiness. She drew in a soft breath, her fingers tracing absent circles on the fabric of her robe. Then she spoke, almost too quietly for me to catch. "Do you ever feel invisible?" I turned my head toward her. The way she said it wasn't casual. Her voice carried something fragile, like a thread that might snap if pulled too hard. She kept her gaze fixed on her hands, her thumb brushing over her knuckles. I mean, I've spent years being the one people lean on, the one they assume will be fine. Reliable, steady, capable. She gave a faint laugh, though it sounded tired rather than amused. But sometimes, I wonder if anyone really sees me. Not the aunt, not the caretaker, not the dependable one. Just me. Her words pressed into me, striking a chord I hadn't expected. For a long moment, I didn't answer. I wanted to be careful, to honor what she had just entrusted to me. Finally, I nodded, my voice low. I think I know what you mean. It's like being present in a room but still, not really being there. People look past you. Or worse, they look at you, but they don't notice what you're carrying. Her eyes flicked up then, meeting mine. In that brief exchange, I saw something raw and unguarded, a mix of relief and vulnerability, as though she hadn't expected me to understand, but was grateful I did. The silence stretched again, but it wasn't empty. It was full of meaning, thick with unspoken things. And before I could think better of it, I found myself admitting something I hadn't even said out loud to myself. My marriage, it doesn't feel like it used to. She's still here, but somehow, I'm lonelier now than I ever was before. Sometimes I lie awake and wonder if she notices how far away we've drifted. Saying it out loud left me strangely unsteady, as if I had opened a door I hadn't meant to. But when I looked back at her, there was no judgment in her eyes. Only a quiet understanding that made my chest ache. She reached out then, almost cautiously, and let her hand rest lightly on my wrist. The touch was soft, tentative, but it held more comfort than any words could have. Her thumb brushed once, just barely, against my skin, a silent reassurance. For a moment, the room fell utterly still, the ticking of the clock, the hum of the air, all of it seemed to fade until there was only the warmth of her touch and the shared weight of our confessions. In the dim light, her face softened. You're not the only one who feels that way, she murmured. And in that instant, I realized we weren't just two lonely people passing time together. We were two hearts, quietly revealing the truths we hid from the world, and maybe even from ourselves. The air between us had shifted. After her hand brushed mine on my wrist, neither of us spoke right away. It was as if words would break something fragile, something better left unspoken. I could feel her warmth radiating through that single point of contact, and yet the sensation spread far beyond, into my chest, my stomach, even the back of my throat where my breath caught. She didn't move her hand immediately. Instead, her fingers rested there, light but steady, as though she wanted me to know she wasn't pulling away. My pulse thudded beneath her touch, and I wondered if she could feel it, if she noticed the way her presence alone had changed the rhythm of my body. When she finally shifted, it wasn't to retreat. It was to come closer. She turned slightly toward me, her robe brushing against my leg again, her shoulder grazing mine. That tiny, accidental pressure was enough to draw my attention fully to her, the curve of her profile in the lamplight, the soft parting of her lips as she exhaled, the faint tremor in her voice when she spoke next. You have no idea how long it's been, she said quietly, since someone just listened to me. Her honesty pressed into me as deeply as her touch had. Without thinking, I turned my hand over beneath hers, letting my palm meet hers fully. Our fingers didn't intertwine, not yet, but the shift was deliberate, an invitation, a response, a silent acknowledgement that I didn't want her to let go. Her hand was warm, the skin soft but marked by the faintest calluses, signs of a life lived in service to others. I traced the edges of her hand with my thumb, tentative, testing, yet she didn't pull back. Instead, she let her fingers curve ever so slightly against mine, a subtle but undeniable return of pressure. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was alive, humming with the awareness of what had just passed between us. I could hear her breathing, steady but deep, and I became aware of my own, how it had grown slower, heavier, as if matching hers. I dared a glance at her face. Her eyes weren't on me but down at our hands, her expression soft, contemplative. And though she didn't smile, there was something in her features that looked almost like relief, as though she had been waiting for this simple closeness without even realizing it. Every instinct told me this was a moment balanced on a knife's edge. We were family by marriage, bound by circumstances that made this nearness dangerous. Yet, in the quiet of that room, none of that seemed to matter. All that mattered was the human truth of two people who had found something they'd been missing: comfort, connection, warmth. Her fingers shifted again, this time brushing against mine in a way that wasn't accidental. She let her hand settle more firmly into mine, no longer tentative, no longer fleeting. And though we sat there in silence, that lingering touch spoke more than either of us dared to say aloud. The quiet stretched on, but it wasn't the heavy kind anymore. It felt alive, thrumming like a low chord struck between us, vibrating softly in the air. Her hand still rested in mine, her skin warm, her touch steady. Every second she didn't pull away deepened the weight of what was happening, not dramatic, not loud, just quietly undeniable. She leaned a little closer, enough that her shoulder pressed more fully into mine. The contact was small, ordinary in any other setting, but here in the dim lamplight, it was electric. I could feel the shape of her body near mine, the warmth radiating from her, the faint brush of her sleeve against the back of my arm. Our conversation had slowed to almost nothing, the words now only bridges to hold us in place rather than roads to travel further. When she did speak, her voice was softer than ever, a murmur meant only for the space between us. "You're easy to be around," she said. The simplicity of it made my chest ache. I turned my head toward her, and she met my gaze, her eyes catching the light. They weren't guarded anymore. They were open, searching, as though she wanted me to see her fully, the strength, the weariness, the longing she had confessed earlier. I noticed details I had never allowed myself to before: the faint lines near her eyes that deepened when she blinked, the graceful slope of her jaw, the way her lips parted slightly as if holding back words she didn't dare speak. The space between us seemed to shrink without either of us making a conscious choice. My breath slowed, heavy, as I realized how close we were. Close enough that I could see the subtle rise and fall of her chest with each inhale. Close enough that I caught the faintest hint of her scent, something soft and clean, with a trace of the lotion she must have applied before bed. Her fingers shifted against mine, not pulling away but tracing lightly over the back of my hand. The motion was delicate, almost absent-minded, but it sent a quiet rush through me, like the air had grown thinner. We were close enough now that if either of us leaned just an inch further, our faces would meet. I felt it in the air, the tension of almost. My heart pounded at the possibility, the danger, the sweetness of it. But neither of us moved that last inch. Instead, we hovered there, suspended in the kind of moment that feels endless, the kind that lives on the edge of action, where silence speaks louder than any words. Her eyes softened, and for a breath, I thought she might close them. But she didn't. She just stayed there, her hand in mine, her shoulder against mine, her face so near that I could feel the warmth of her breath brush faintly across my skin. It was not a kiss. It was not a confession. But it was everything in between, a nearness of hearts, beating in quiet, dangerous harmony. The moment hung suspended between us, fragile and heavy at the same time. Her face was still close, her breath soft against my skin, her hand warm in mine. It felt like the entire night had been leading to this delicate balance. The almost, the nearness, the quiet ache of what neither of us dared to cross. Then, as if she sensed the edge we stood upon, she eased back slightly. Just enough to break the tension, to let the air flow between us again. She didn't pull her hand from mine, not yet, but her eyes softened with a kind of gentle restraint. "I should let you rest," she whispered. The words were simple, but they carried weight, a careful reminder that whatever had sparked here tonight had to remain unspoken, at least for now. Still, there was no regret in her tone. If anything, there was a warmth, a quiet gratitude, as though she cherished what had happened without asking for more. She rose from the bed with slow grace, the mattress lifting as her weight left it. The folds of her robe shifted around her as she straightened, smoothing the fabric absent-mindedly with one hand. I watched her, every movement somehow magnified in the low light, etched into my mind with sharp clarity. Before she turned toward the door, she hesitated. For a moment I thought she might leave without another word. But then she leaned toward me, her steps soundless on the floor. She bent close, close enough that the faint strands of her hair brushed against my cheek. And then she pressed her lips softly against my skin, not on my lips, not even on my forehead, but on my cheek. A kiss that was tender, lingering just long enough to make my breath catch. It wasn't a kiss of passion. It was a kiss of reassurance, of presence, of unspoken promise. Her hand came to rest briefly on my shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Good night," she murmured, her voice so low it seemed to blend with the air itself. "You're not as alone as you think." And then she drew back, her eyes meeting mine one last time. For a heartbeat, the room felt timeless. No rules, no boundaries, just the truth of what had quietly unfolded between us. Then she turned and walked toward the door, opening it just enough to let the hallway light spill into the room before slipping out. The door closed softly behind her. I sat there for a long time, my hand still tingling where hers had rested, my cheek still warm from her kiss. The silence returned, but it was different now, no longer hollow, no longer heavy. It was filled with the echo of her presence, the quiet memory of shared confessions, of touches that lingered longer than they should have. I lay back against the pillow, staring into the dark, my chest still unsteady. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or how the world outside that room might judge what had passed. But for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel abandoned. I felt seen. And as I drifted toward sleep, I carried with me the truth she had left behind, that even in the quietest loneliness, connection can find its way through, sometimes in the most unexpected knock at the door.